Hello, and welcome to Chapter 16 of our textbook. This is going to be the full lecture of Chapter 16. I recommend you watch it before class or as soon as after class as possible. If you have not taken History of World Civilization, the first part, you probably did not get to chapter 15, or you have not seen chapter 15, which is about the expansion in the New World. I recommend that you read that chapter as well. It is an optional chapter for this course, but let me get into the chapter. So chapter 16, the Western European expansion and the Ottoman Habsburg struggle. This is a chapter that will describe when multiple civilizations that have very different goals, very different belief systems, how they interact. And we'll be talking a lot about Europe and about the Middle East and the conflict between Europe, a very Roman Catholic Europe, although there is a growing Protestant movement at this time, and the overtaking and the creation of the Ottoman Empire. And that's going to have a very big influence on ideas in Europe as well. Europe had been used to the city of Constantinople as a Greek Orthodox speaking city, still a Christian city. When the Ottoman Empire finally takes it over, it becomes a Muslim city. And that's going to affect trade routes as well as bring it into conflict with the European Christian belief system. So we'll be talking about Europe. We'll be talking about the Middle East. Constantinople is right at the point of my arrow. And we'll also be talking a little bit about the Americas because that is going to be contested territory. We'll also be talking about Africa and how one small kingdom in Europe, the Portuguese, managed to circumnavigate this very large continent and make it into the Indian Ocean, and all of the promises that were in that oceanic area, all the goods that they could get. So we'll start in, of all places, Spain. Spain had not, for the vast majority of European history since the Roman Empire in the West, had not been a unified single kingdom. It had been multiple kingdoms. At one time, 5 separate kingdoms: Navarre, Castile, Aragon, Portugal. So a lot of these different Christian kingdoms, and there will be a Muslim kingdom or a dynasty in what we now think of as Spain. Well, that is going to create a lot of friction in that area, partially because the Christian kingdoms are going to be fighting with each other to gain greater shares of territory, and the Muslim dynasty is going to be, at some points, fighting against Christians, and at other points, helping different Christian kingdoms out to help with their fighting against the other Christian kingdoms. It is a very busy, very uh, interesting area of history that is only in the past few decades that there have been Western scholars that have been looking into this seriously. However, as we're starting our story in around the year 1450, the Christian kingdoms will eventually unite because of a marriage between the king of one kingdom and the queen of another kingdom. That's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And they unite their Christian kingdoms into a single kingdom, and therefore, with the ability to join each other, they're going to move on the Muslim dynasty that is there. The term that will be used for that movement is the Reconquista, or the reconquest of this area. It's kind of a misnomer, if only because the Muslim dynasty that was there had been there since 711 CE. So that's 700 years before the Reconquista. So the idea that the Spanish Christian kingdoms were reconquering that area is kind of a stretch. But the idea of having Europe as a Christian continent grows out of the Crusades. And that had been held 400 years before this point, where Christian knights go to reclaim the Holy Land, Jerusalem, the Levant, from those Turkish and the Seljuk Turks and other dynasties, Muslim dynasties that happened to hold it. So that drive in Europe to make it unified as a single Christian area is going to succeed, except for the fact that we'll have a schism or a split between the Roman Catholic Christians and the Protestants. That's going to come in the very early 16th century. When in about 1480, Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, managed to overtake the Muslim dynasties. They take the land, they drive out many of the Muslims and the Jews that had lived in that area for 700 years, but a few stay. A handful of them stay either to work with the Christian community, or they themselves will convert to Christianity. And that is another part of their story. However, the newly grown Empire of Spain, or Kingdom of Spain, has its entire area on the Iberian Peninsula, but it's going to move out, mainly because it has a neighbor, Portugal. Portugal is on the very westernmost coast of Europe. The Portuguese had a fascinating prince by the name of Prince Henry. He's known to us as Prince Henry the Navigator. And Prince Henry will be interested in trading with the various components in India and the islands known as Malacca and China. There was one thing standing in their way, however, and that is, had they gone east across the Mediterranean Sea, they would have been stopped by the landmass we know as the Middle East. And that area was dominated by Muslims. And the Portuguese, being Christian, did not want to be in that competition of trading with the Muslims. They wanted to find a new route to get to the Indian Ocean. That meant traveling west and traveling south. And they're going to be aided in new techniques of shipbuilding. And I'll talk about that more in class. And they're going to be aided by various navigational instruments that they will have used. Mainly, they got from the Muslim region, or various other regions. These are instruments that had been used for hundreds of years uh, and applied to land masses, but the Portuguese will apply them to seagoing vessels, such instruments as the astrolabe. This is a, whoops, let me make sure it's not shining too badly. This is an astrolabe. It's a model. It's not a real one because it doesn't have the proper sighting, but it is used to judge the angle of stars above the horizon. So if you're on a ship, you would sight a certain star and tighten it up. And uh, this movable arm, once you've got your sighting done, would give you the angle of the star. And then, of course, the horizon would be at 90 degrees. And it would be a fairly straightforward mathematical formula in order to use this. Now, this works quite well in finding out where you are north and south. The latitude, that's the movement north and south. Those are the lines that we see on the globe around the equator and the parallel lines going north and south. And so the angles of stars, if you've got the proper books that tell you where the angles of stars are at particular times of year, you can kind of judge very closely where you are north and south. East and west, however, that measurement is known as longitude. That's much harder to measure because you don't have the same sort of accessibility to instruments like the astrolabe. Now, another instrument that would have been very useful for these voyages as well would have been something like this. This is still another model. This is a portable sundial. And this sundial happens to have on the inside a compass. The magnetic compass is going to be a huge boost for the sailors going over the sea, out of the sight of land in many situations, to be able to tell what direction they're going. And of course, the sundial would allow them to know time of day. All of these could help in a system of navigation known as dead reckoning, where they would judge by the speed of the ship. They would judge by the locations that they could sight approximately where they were. Everything would be very carefully written down in journals or captain's logs or navigator's logs and kept so that they could recreate those journeys. So, as I had mentioned, the union of Aragon and Castile, that is the union of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to become Spain. The Kingdom of Spain, they would drive out the Muslims and the Jews, and those that were not driven out, those who stayed and converted, were never trusted. And so they will be subjected to the Spanish Inquisition. That is something I'll talk about a little bit later in this chapter. Granada and Cordoba are basically the two main cities that the Muslim dynasties had created beautiful mosques, large palaces, um, very defensible fortresses. So it was very difficult to get them out. However, once we have the unification of Spain, we have Ferdinand and Isabella, no longer have anywhere else to conquer. But they are seeing the success of the Portuguese as the Portuguese basically make it to the Indian Ocean. And the Portuguese will, in fact, create a route and put fortresses all along the route and guard it so that no one else can use it. So Spain is looking at that development and thinking, aha, maybe there's some way we could get in on this. But the route to the east is taken, the route to the south is now taken by the Portuguese. All that's left, the north is not feasible because they did know about the North Pole. But going west, now, people of the time knew, the educated people knew that the world was round. That had been determined by a Greek librarian and mathematician by the name of Eratosthenes in the 2nd century BCE. So it had been known for quite some time. Eratosthenes not only helped to determine the world was round, spherical, he also figured out how big it was. It was very interesting development. His figures were mainly accepted. And so, if you think about it, the globe was thought to be so big, and the people of the time of the 15th century knew approximately how far it was from Portugal going east to China. And they knew that east of China were some islands, the Spice Islands, Malacca, uh, an area we now think of as Indonesia and Micronesia, etc. So they had an idea of Europe and Asia as this landmass, and they knew how wide it was, meaning that their understanding of the rest of the world was that it was just ocean. And you could travel west and you would be on this ocean and traveling around the globe and coming back and making it to China. That was considered feasible in terms of it is a good thought experiment, but the distance, the known distance that they would have to travel, and if it was all ocean, would be incomprehensibly huge. It would mean they could not carry, a ship could not physically carry enough water and supplies to make that long of a voyage. Here comes Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who has a book. And Columbus has a book that was written by a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. And this cardinal had questioned Eratosthenes' original mathematics, number one. And this cardinal came up with the idea that the world was much smaller than Eratosthenes had figured. His math was incorrect. Eratosthenes was within a few percentage points of getting the right answer. But this cardinal is insisting that that old math was wrong and his math was correct, and that the Earth was not as big around as the ancient Greeks thought it was, and most educated people at the time thought it was. Also, if you travel west of Europe, kind of southwest, you run into lots of little islands. The Azores, the Canaries, those had all been claimed by Portugal. But Columbus's thinking was, wait a minute, we travel west and there's lots of islands. And if we think about the east part of China, there's lots of islands there. Maybe the world is smaller than we thought it was, and it's islands all the way across, not empty ocean as was previously thought of. And using this logic, he will convince Ferdinand and Isabella to put money into his voyage that he will take in 1492. My husband and I did a show on our channel, History Unsettled, about the myth of Columbus trying to prove the world was round. He was doing no such thing. I'll put a link into the modules so you can see the show, because we go into even greater detail about this. But suffice to say, Columbus was not looking for to show that the world was round. He was looking for a path to China through the west, and he supposed he could make it just island hopping. He did not realize that there were continents in his way, and that once you got over the continents, there was a giant ocean, much bigger than any of the oceans they had really known about. There was no way Columbus could have made it. There was no way any of the ships of the time could have made it in a single voyage. So that's what Ferdinand and Isabella are investing in. Meanwhile, the Portuguese are investing in the route to the south, going down the west coast of Africa and hoping they could go back up the east coast of Africa. The Europeans did not know how far down Africa went. The Chinese did. The Arabic sailors probably did, because they traveled up and down the eastern coast of Africa quite frequently, all the way down to Madagascar and even lower. But the Europeans had not gotten that far down yet. So when we talk about Vasco da Gama getting to the Indian Ocean by circumnavigating Africa, he's not discovering really anything that's new to the Indians, the Arab traders and sailors, and certainly not the Chinese. They had all traveled those routes quite frequently, but they had never gone down the east coast of Africa and then come up the west coast. They had no reason to. All of their trade routes going east and west now traveled over land that they had complete control over. So what I'm talking about is, here is Portugal. They are finding routes that will take them down the west coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then back up the east coast and eventually into India. However, of course, these areas on the west coast of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, in the Arab Sea, in the Strait of Hormuz, or the Persian Gulf as we call it now, and in the Red Sea, these had all been very well traveled for thousands of years by sailors out of India, by sailors out of the Abbasid dynasty, etc. And we'll talk a lot about uh, that those trade routes. They were extremely important. Uh, but the Portuguese have to go the long way. Uh, you can also see here in Spain the idea of going west. They would have, Columbus going west would have hit the Azore Islands and continued on. Um, Knowing that all of these islands were here made Columbus think that maybe he could do islands all the way. One of the most important aspects of these islands, especially for the Portuguese, was not just dropping off points. Some of them were not inhabited at all. And so Portugal is going to take them over. And because they are so much further south than Europe, they have a semi tropical environment. And so the Portuguese are going to start setting up sugarcane plantations, which is going to be a huge money crop for the Portuguese. And unfortunately, it will also encourage the Portuguese to start up the Atlantic slave trade. So this is going to be the birth of that as well. So the Ottomans, they were a group of Turks. We'll call them the Ottoman Turks. They will come out of Central Asia. They will be Muslim, but it's a completely different group of people, a very separate group of people than the Muslims that had occupied Spain, the Muslims that had occupied North Africa, the Muslims that had occupied the Saudi Peninsula, Baghdad, etc. In fact, the Ottoman Turks are going to be in conflict with those Muslim dynasties that were already in those areas, North Africa and the Middle East. However, one thing stood in the way of the Ottomans truly expanding their empire, and that was the city of Constantinople. The city of Constantinople had been built in around 325 CE. So it had been there for 1,000 years by the time the Ottomans attempt to take it. It had defended itself with massive walls. It had a very rich tradition. They considered themselves descendants of the Roman Empire. They were Christian. The Byzantine Empire they were Christian, but they were Greek Orthodox. They were Greek speaking. And so they had a very different culture than the other European Christians. But Constantinople is right on an isthmus that the trade route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea has to go past. And so they had made incredible fortunes by being that trading hub. But the Ottoman Turks are going to look at that city as a possible capital of their empire because of its access to the sea, because of the trading possibilities, because it was a very well defended fortress that they could take. And the Constantinople, there's just a very small distance between that point and the rest of Europe. So it was considered a very, very valuable situation. The Ottoman Turks, in spreading out, are going to try to take Constantinople. It will take them several years. They will besiege the city. Besiege means you set up your troops around it, you don't let anyone in or out, and hopefully the people inside either surrender or they starve to death or they get um, killed by disease. It is a nasty way of fighting a war. But the Ottomans, under their emperor Mehmet II, are not going to be that patient. They're going to institute new technologies to get themselves in that wall, and that new technology was cannons, gunpowder. Mehmet II will have constructed the largest cannon ever devised, called the Grand Bombard. Here you have a depiction of it. It's huge. Now, the Grand Bombard, I don't know if it's still in existence. The um, Grand Bombard, the copies of it, they had made multiple different cannons based on it, are in England. The English stole it, and it's in a uh, museum in Portsmouth, England. And I'll show you some pictures when we have class. But it is uh, huge. You can't imagine. And it shot, um, especially made cannonballs. They were actually rocks, weighed about 300 pounds, and it took 600 pounds of gunpowder in order to make, in order to fire off that cannon. I'll talk about more about it in class. But they will eventually be successful in taking the city of Constantinople, and it becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and they changed the name to Istanbul. The name goes through various different changes over the centuries. It is now known as Istanbul, and uh, it's still the capital of that area, known as Turkey now. After the Turks, the Ottomans will take over Constantinople in 1453, change the name, create a Muslim empire in place of the old Christian empire, and basically change the face of the whole city. So now we have the start of right at the border of Europe. We have the Muslim Ottoman Turks who are going to be looking to expand. They're not going to be happy with just the area they had taken, and they will take that area and hold on to it from 1453 until 1917. So, very long time. However, the Ottomans are not going to be happy with just taking the area around Constantinople. They will move into Europe. Uh, they will be moving basically through Central Europe and through the Balkan Peninsula. It's part of the reason why the Balkans are going to have lots of problems, because they will take certain Balkan regions, turn them into Muslim regions, part of the Ottoman Empire, but other regions of the Balkans and Central Europe will remain Christian, either Serbian Orthodox, which is an offshoot of Greek Orthodox, or Roman Catholic, and a handful of Protestants. Um, And so we're going to have at least a century or two of on again, off again warfare for a certain portion of Europe. The Ottoman Turks are also going to move south into the area we know as the Levant, um, which is the easternmost part of the Mediterranean Sea, the area we now know as Jordan and Israel. And they'll also move into Egypt and defeat the Mamluks, who were the rulers of Egypt at that time. Now, this is Muslim against Muslim violence. So the Ottomans are not doing these wars necessarily for religious purposes. They're doing them to expand their empire. Uh, and they will move or push out many Christians, and they will try to expand into Eastern Europe. And there's a lot of different wars that are going to happen between the Europeans and the Ottoman Turks. In fact, to be called a Turk, an Ottoman Turk, is kind of would be an insult in Europe. And the wars are going to be particularly nasty. One of the most famous of the soldiers, the Christian soldiers fighting against the Ottoman Turks will be a man named Vlad Tepes. He is a ruler of an area, I believe it's Wallachia and Transylvania area. We now call it Romania and Hungary, but then it was Wallachia and Transylvania. And Vlad Tepes will be known by a nickname, Vlad the Impaler, because he will have very little or no mercy against any Ottomans or Muslims that he captures. He will be busy impaling them. And the stories are particularly gross about what he does to his prisoners. He will be rewarded by the Holy Roman Emperor, a man named Sigismund, for his good works, killing Muslims, and be given the award medal known as the Order of the Dragon. Sigismund had his special order made, and so Vlad Tepes now changes his name to recognize his holding of this Order of the Dragon to Vlad Dragul. It is this name, Dragul, that we're a little bit more familiar with him because a 19th century author by the name of Bram Stoker is going to write a horror novel, and he's going to steal Vlad Dragul's name and use it for his main character, a vampire. This is where we get the name Dracula. And of course, Dracula is set in Transylvania, Wallachia. So, yeah, he is Vlad Dragul or Vlad the Impaler, the stuff of nightmares. Anyway, so the Ottoman Empire, if you will see their new capital of Istanbul, they will move out into these areas, capturing all sorts of areas, even down into the Red Sea, across North Africa, and then into Eastern Europe, into the Balkans, and moving very slowly up into the area we know as Hungary and Austria. And this is where the fighting is going to get really intense. But having control over this large of an area Number one is it's difficult, yes. But number two, the trading routes to India, throughout the Mediterranean, they're all under the control of the Ottoman Empire. So they're going to be making a huge amount of money off of that trade. And that's pretty much what they wanted to do. What they set out to create is this giant empire based on trade. But as they get into, excuse me, into Vienna, they're going to come across a particular family known as the Habsburgs. Um, by the way, your they're properly spelled Habsburg, but in this PowerPoint they had spelled it wrong. It's the Habsburgs. Uh, they are a very powerful family in uh, the area of Central Europe. In fact, they will be the Holy Roman Emperors, will come out of that family, which is a title meaning that you have a very large control, but mainly over the Catholic areas of Europe. So the Habsburgs, this very large and important family in Vienna, are going to end up marrying members of the Spanish royal family. And so now they have this super empire. The Habsburgs will own personally more land than almost anyone uh, in history, their personal land, because this is the moment at which the Spanish are moving out into the New World, into the Americas. And so, whoever is ruling the throne of the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire has also control over South America and parts of Central America. It's huge. The man who is going to be overseeing this incredibly gigantic empire is a man named Charles V, this gentleman right here. Um, he is going to have so much to deal with in his life as far as ruling a giant empire. He's going to be one of the people fighting against the Ottoman Turks. There will be, during his rule, will be the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther and various theologians will break off of the Roman Catholic Church. That's going to start a whole cycle of religious wars. And he's just got a giant territory that he has to deal with no actual, communications other than messages back and forth. Charles V, however, was an extremely capable ruler, uh, and at many times did some pretty fantastic administrative uh, capabilities. He also has a singular notoriety as a Holy Roman Emperor. He has a candy bar named after him. If you go to bodegas in Mexico, and I sometimes find them here, you can get Carlos Quinte bars or Charles V bars. They're candy bars. And, they're pretty good. Um, but they are named after Emperor Charles V. So, yeah, that's him. Doesn't look like him on the candy bar, but yes, that's the Charles V. So you can see all of the different lands that he is trying to control. the Spanish Habsburg territories. It's not just Spain. They also happen to control Sardinia, Sicily, and the southern part of Italy, as well as areas that we now know as the Netherlands. Uh, Also, he has control over the Holy Roman Empire and his own lands, the Austrian Habsburg lands. I, I'm, this is getting confusing. I realize that, but it does give you some idea about how spread out a region he ruled. And this doesn't show any of his holdings in the New World in South America. So one of the big concerns for Charles V and the other Holy Roman emperors is to stop the Ottoman Turks from moving further into Europe. They will be somewhat successful, but the Ottoman Turks will get all the way up to the city of Bratislava, Slovakia. Uh, this is further north than Vienna, uh, the capital of Austria now. So they were quite a ways into Central Europe, into what we would consider the heart of Central Europe. But the Habsburgs are going to be able to push them out. Um, and the Habsburgs will also have to fight them on the sea as well. They will build an alliance. I promise I'll come back to this slide, but they will build an alliance with the city of Venice. The city of Venice will be a major trading uh, city, having its own territories around the city and down the coastline of the Balkans. So, as you can see, they're touching up against the Ottoman territories as well. So, it just makes sense that the Venetians and the Habsburgs are going to join to fight the Ottomans, and they will do it by sea in one of the largest naval battles that will be held until the 20th century, the Battle of Lepanto, um, in which the Habsburgs and the Venetians will defeat the Ottomans. The year is 1572. And so the Ottomans are going to have to stop moving by sea. They will continue, however, to try to take more land in Central Europe. The Ottomans are also going to be competing for trading areas between not just the Mediterranean Sea, of course, here's Istanbul, but also in their properties with the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, which of course lead into the Arab Sea and the Indian Ocean, which gives them access to the goods of India, the goods of China, um, Southeast Asia, and of course, Indonesia. So we're talking about mainly cotton, silk, tea, spices. But there's one other thing that's very important for the Ottoman Turks and eventually for the Europeans as well. This is not discussed, I think, often enough because I think it helps to explain one of the reasons why everyone was so desperate to get here. Uh, Tea is nice, sugar is nice, spices are nice. However, If you recall that I had talked about the Ottomans using a cannon and gunpowder to knock down the walls of Constantinople. Gunpowder and guns and cannons were now firmly ensconced in the militaries of Europe, very seriously. But gunpowder has three ingredients. It doesn't have a lot of ingredients in it. It has three ingredients: sulfur, which comes from volcanoes, plenty of volcanoes in Europe, no problem. They need charcoal, which helps it to burn. That's made out of trees, so that's not a big deal. Those two items were very easily accessible in Europe. Third, or what makes up about 60% of gunpowder, is a chemical called potassium nitrate. We also call it saltpeter. That's what makes it explosive. There are very few natural sources of saltpeter or potassium nitrate. There weren't that many natural sources in Europe. The Europeans will eventually figure out how to make it, but for the amount that was needed, finding sources would be preferable to actually manufacturing it, because it takes a while to manufacture. Well, here in the area north and west of the Bay of Bengals, along the Ganges River, uh, an area in India known as Bihar, uh, potassium nitrate occurs naturally. It is literally scooped up off of the ground after the monsoon season. Control of this area meant the control of most of the gunpowder in Europe. So, by having a trade route that is not going through the Ottoman Empire, which of course are your enemies if you're a European Christian, um, you want to have access to that gunpowder, to that potassium nitrate. We will see with the Ottoman Empire, the Persian area that we'll talk about a little bit later, the Safavid Empire, and the empire that we'll talk about in a later chapter called the Mughal Empire in India. These three empires are known as the gunpowder empires for their use of arms. But it's this highly contested area right here that's going to be really the area everybody needs to get to in order to get that potassium nitrate. Anyway, I'm off on a. This is something I've done a lot of specialized research in. Anyway, so firearms, a use of the firearms is going to be a huge technological stage. It's going to change warfare in a big way. It is going to take warfare out of the hands of specially trained knights in armor with very expensive horses, very expensive weapons. A knight in shining armor against a gun, bonus points to the gun. And the gun is cheaper, somewhat, pretty much cheaper. And you don't have to have someone who's trained all of their lives in weaponry like swords and spears and all that sort of stuff. You hand somebody a gun and you could train them within an hour to load it and shoot it. And the guns at the time were not that accurate. But if you're shooting into a group of people, they do a lot of damage. Anyway, so firearms are not just new ways of killing people. They're going to change the nature of the military and it's going to change the nature of fighting, which is going to change the nature of the governments. That's going to centralize the government because um, under the older systems, it was up to each lord to provide knights to fight. Now, with gunfire, with gunpowder, with weapons, you need lots of people fighting, and the only uh, entities that could afford that are very, very rich kings with lots and lots of territory that they're making money off of. And if they want to make more money, they need to get more territory. So, just that little, it's a pretty big change of technology, is going to have a cascading effect, changing a lot. So it is going to help to centralize power in the hands of very few, very powerful kings and emperors. Um, as the Ottomans take over area, and we see they take over parts of Europe, they take over most of the Middle East and North Africa. That's a huge amount of territory. Um, and they will basically do what smart conquerors will have done for uh, millennia. And that is, when you gain land, you give parts of it to the people who helped you gain it, to your generals, to the leaders of your troops, even some small farms to the troops as well. This allows you to have them under your control with someone uh, running that area that now owns that area that basically owes you a favor. So that's a very smart way of keeping control of that area. Um, but in order to keep uh, expanding the Ottoman Empire, in order to pay for it, uh, they're going to need more than just taking land. They're going to need taxes paid in coin so that they can buy what they need. So it's going to be extremely important to collect those taxes, which means a very highly organized administration, keeping track of census, how many people are living, how much property and territory and goods they have, and actually physically taxing people. Now, the Ottoman Empire had a couple of very curious taxes as well. One was called the child tax. Now, they wasn't based on how many children you had. They actually collected children. They went to villages, especially Christian villages, and asked for a number of young boys. They wanted promising ones, smart ones. Uh, and if your family was an extremely poor peasant family and you had a lot of mouths to feed, maybe giving up a child was an option. But nevertheless, the Ottoman Empire will collect many of these children, will bring them into Constantinople, raise them as troops, raise them as administrators, convert them to Islam, give them a very substantial education, and these would be known as janissaries, who would be the troops and who would move up into the Ottoman Empire. Something to understand about the Ottoman Empire as well is that they needed help administering. And rather than having to grow administrations that were there, they used slave labor. But for the Ottoman Empire, they did not put the stigma of enslaving people that we kind of associate with an enslaved people. There wasn't the stigma attached. In fact, it was not a bad living. They were well educated. Uh, they were uh, taken care of. They achieved extremely high status jobs, uh, running the administration for the Ottoman Empire. Um, but this was not chattel slavery. This was not slavery based on race. Uh, many of these slaves had sold them. Many of these people had sold themselves into slavery in order to get those good jobs. Um, so it is a very unique situation in the Ottoman Empire, one that is not going to be duplicated. So you cannot even compare them to what is going to happen with the Atlantic slave trade and the enslaved Africans, because the Ottoman Empire's slavery was not based on race. So it is a fascinating aspect of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans will be working on ruling their empires. Of course, you need armies, you need money to pay armies, and you also need to buy the weapons for the armies. And the Janissaries were known for using firearms. They uh, also were collecting uh, uh, taxes, collecting coins, uh, and they used the armies to help do that. Uh, it also took quite a bit of administrative work in order to keep this empire going. Meanwhile, that's the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor, uh, they've got a new source of wealth. They have moved into, they didn't find, Christopher Columbus doesn't find China, of course. He finds uh, the New World. And so that is all claimed for Spain. And of course, that means Charles V has got control over those areas. So the Ottomans will create uh, a beautiful capital city, turning, they will turn some of the great cathedrals, the great Greek Orthodox cathedrals, turn them into mosques, repurpose them, as it were, but they will also build their own architecture, their own mosques and palaces, such as Topkapi Palace. Just a tremendous uh, uh, building and very, very big. But they will also encourage public festivals and theater as well to create a court that is not just aimed towards collecting taxes and having a military, but also spectacular in terms of art, in terms of uh, performances and music, in order to keep people busy, entertained, and feel like they are part of something special. So here is the repurposing of uh, the, it was a church originally known as the Hagia Sophia, but it is repurposed as a mosque. The minarets were added uh, by the Ottoman Turks. Now, in 1917, 1918, when the government of Turkey becomes secularized, they turned Hagia Sophia into a uh, into a museum. So it was open to visitors. So you could go in and see this amazing church slash mosque that had been there since the 7th century. So it's really very, very old. Um, but within the last 6 months, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, has closed it as a museum and has repurposed it as a mosque. And I'm feeling I've always wanted to see this building, and now I'm wondering if we'll ever get to see it or if it's closed off to the public. I don't know all of the details for that. So, in order to keep up with uh, with the Ottomans, we see the Spanish Habsburgs pouring money into their capital. They have the money, though. This is what is unique about Spain colonizing the New World, colonizing Central America and South America. They were looking for gold. They really wanted gold. They only found a little bit, um, but they will eventually find magnificent silver mines in an area we now know as Bolivia. And so uh, they will be digging up that silver, using enslaved people to dig up that silver. And that silver is going to go directly into the pocket of the King of Spain, where this time it's going to be Philip II, who's going to take over after Charles V dies. Uh, and so the Spanish crown itself becomes extraordinarily rich, but it means that everything else in Spain, the prices go up because the money is not necessarily going to everybody else, it's going to the crown. And then the crown has to buy things. And so everybody knows the crown is wealthy, the prices go up. And the prices go up for everybody, meaning that the more silver that is being brought from the New World going into the pockets of the King of Spain is going to make the prices rise in Spain, and it's going to make those things that are manufactured in Spain less desirable for the people of the rest of Europe. And so it is this weird economic problem that Spain is going to have. The more cash flow they have coming in, the worse their economy is going to be. Philip II is also going to have to spend a huge amount of money promoting Catholic uh, churches, trying to unite his kingdom and those other parts uh, of the New World under the Catholic Church. That takes a lot of money to pay for priests and monks to get over there to convert people. So it's extremely expensive. He's also going to pay for festivals and celebrations to, bring the elegance of the Spanish court into that realm that other courts had been um, enjoying. The King of France, other kings had been wealthy, and of course, the Ottoman Empire had been wealthy as well. So, you want your court to be on par with all these other things. So that means investing in your military, yes, but also investing in the things that make you look intellectual, the things that make you look like you're a patron of the arts, etc. But, pardon me, excuse me. Part of that, part of that investing, especially in conversion, especially in using the Catholic Church to to unify this area that had for a very long time been disunified as far as multiple kingdoms. Now that it's under one king, you want to use all of the uh, all of the assets that you have to try to unify your kingdom into one. But part of that unification process would be a movement in the Catholic Church that Philip II will support, known as the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was a movement mainly by Dominican monks. It was one of the orders of the Roman Catholic Church to root out heresy. Heresy is a really interesting problem because uh, it is trying to find people who weren't Christian enough or weren't Catholic enough. Um, and it 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 was a very ritualistic program that happened. Uh, my husband and I have also done a video on heresy. I'll make sure uh, that that link is in if you want to find out a little bit more detail. But uh, the process, the ritual in Spain, in order to make it impactful for the rest of the population, is that you create a spectacle of it. Remember, this is a world without television or radio or mass communication of any kind. Uh, you made a spectacle with lots of different uh, audience members, and you put on what was called a show trial or an auto da fe, which means a movement of faith or an act of faith. Uh, and this is what we know as the Spanish Inquisition. And the idea is to question the person suspected of heresy. Uh, and torture was part of that. The torture was not seen as a punishment, it was seen by the Inquisition as a way to get at the truth. We now know, because we've got some basic understanding of psychology, that people are going to say uh, whatever they need to make the pain stop once you start using torture. But the Spanish Inquisition did not have that sort of psychological insights. So torture was a way to get to the truth, or at least showing the instruments of torture. They didn't torture everyone. And the idea was to get the person accused of heresy to recant. That means to see the error of their ways, admit they are wrong, do penance, some sort of a punishment, and promise not to do it again. If, on the other hand, the person suspected of heresy did not change their ways, then they were condemned by the Inquisition in a big show trial. They were condemned as unrepentant heretics. But the church, and this is an important part, the Roman Catholic Church did not actually uh, uh, kill people, execute them themselves. The people that were seen as unrepentant heretics were executed by the state. So the church handed over these people to the state, to the king, and they executed them. So it's an important point, but it does show how tightly interwoven the state, the power structure, and the church was. To be able to say, kill that person and do it, um, that's a that's a pretty harrowing sort of experience. So this is an image of an auto da fe, or an act of faith, and you can see people just crowding around, looking at it, watching to see what is happening. It, would have been entertainment. Um, Most of the people who were subject to the auto da fe in Spain under the Spanish Inquisition were those Jews and Muslims whose family had converted to Christianity maybe generations before this, uh, and who had been practicing Christians, but they were always held under suspicion, even after generations of practicing Christianity. Uh, it is true that some of them held synagogue in secret, that they went through the motions of Christianity, but had been Jews and Muslims all along. Uh, but that was a very small part of the um, population. So when we talk about expansion of culture and the arts, um, we're seeing all of a sudden Spanish artists becoming popular in Europe, the way 100 years earlier than this, uh, uh, Italian or Italians, artists from the Italian peninsula were popular, or artists from the German lands were popular. Now we see artists from Spain, especially artists working in a style we call mannerism. Uh, in particular, one gentleman by the name of El Greco, uh, which means the Greek. He wasn't Spanish at all. He was a Greek artist who moves to Spain and becomes a favorite of the court. And he becomes a very well known artist for his portraiture, for his biblical themes, and for his landscapes. This is his image of the city of Toledo. And it is not, his work is not based on perfect, accurate painting of a subject as you would have seen come out of Florence with Da Vinci, or the Renaissance artists. Greco is painting in a later style called mannerism that is emphasizing emotion. And so you see this very romanticized view of the city of Toledo. Uh, it's it actually captures the feeling of the city, if not what the city looks like. However, if you go to Toledo today, you can see this tower, this bridge. I've been there. And I have pictures of this tower and the church and everything. So it is not that it's inaccurate. It's not that he couldn't paint perfectly. It is that he's infusing his emotions into his painting as well as um, his technique. He also had used very thick paints, which was different than a lot of the Renaissance artists. Um, but the Spanish court, because they have that money, they're spending money on art, they're spending money on literature and theater, all encouraging these people to create, especially in the Spanish language. There's an important point. So, aside from the fighting back and forth of the Muslims versus the Christians. Uh, we see a lot of seafaring and sailing going on at this time. Um, we can think of it as an age of exploration. Uh, some of what they're um, finding is not that they're finding someplace new, because there were already millions of people living in the New World, Native Americans, um, the natives of South America, the empires of the Aztecs and the Incas, and a few of the Mayas left over. Um, and if you want to read more about them, read chapter 15. Uh, but all of these technologies would have been extremely expensive to invest in. And the Chinese were also investing in these technologies. The uh, sailors from the Arab Peninsula and from India were also investing in these technologies. So being able to sail from point A to point B, to have all of these goods moving around, um, makes for a very interesting look at the world now. Now we're seeing the world as being very interconnected. Now, not interconnected the way we think of as being able to order something and it shows up a couple of days to a few weeks later, depending on how much you want to pay for it. Uh, there was always sailing with your fingers crossed. There are very few people as superstitious as those sailors were, um, because there were lots of things that could go wrong, storms, etc. Sailing has gotten a lot safer since those times. They didn't have all the technology that we have now. They didn't have GPS. It was very easy to get lost. Um, and so it wasn't just uh, a factor of jumping on a boat and going somewhere. It had to be planned. You had to have provisions. Even building the boats were extremely expensive. Uh, and you needed people who knew what they were doing in order to make sure you got back. But if you got back, uh, you would be rich. The idea that, what's the big deal of going to the Spice Islands and bringing back cloves? I can go buy a bag of cloves at Coco or at Super H Mart for a couple bucks. Well, that bag that you get would have been a luxury in Europe. Took a lot to get it there. And you could sell it by the teaspoon. Spices are an incredibly uh, good um, trade item because they're dried, they keep for a long time. You can put a whole bunch in a barrel and seal it up. And if you make it back, then you sell them by the teaspoon and the tablespoonful, because a lot of people couldn't afford a huge amount of these luxury spices. In fact, we see even today some of these concepts of some of these spices. Uh, if you are a person from India, from the Indonesian area, from Asia, it's not a big deal to have spices uh, like uh, cloves, like nutmeg. Uh, but Europe, they were very rare. And so they were used sparingly. They were used almost as a ritual aspect. If you think about it this way, a lot of the spices that came from the Spice Islands, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, uh, and even sugar. uh, in Europe, and then by extension in America, were not necessarily spices that we ate or used or put in our tea or coffee every day. Uh, and so they're kind of saved for these special moments. In other words, do you want to buy a pumpkin spice latte in April? No. You wait until September, and then everyone goes crazy. Yes, pumpkin spice lattes are available in September, October. Um, that's what I mean by ritualizing it. That's making it special. And ironically, pie spice is a collection of many of those spices that the Portuguese risked their lives to bring back to Europe to make a fortune for themselves. Anyway, that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a better idea of the chapter, although definitely read it because I didn't go over every particular matter of it. And thanks a lot.